Here's the thing to clear up right away. They did in fact wash their hands. This point needs addressing immediately, because the premise built into this video's title, however appealing as a hook, rests on an assumption that history simply doesn't back up. Ancient Romans washed their hands before meals as a routine social custom, one so deeply built into daily life that it went almost unnoticed, similar to how people today buckle their seatbelts without thinking about it. Ancient Egyptians bathed on a regular basis using a soap-like substance made from animal fat combined with plant ash. Islamic tradition built ritual hand-washing before prayer into religious law more than 14 centuries ago, establishing what may be the most consistently maintained hand hygiene practice in human history. Jewish law similarly required ritual washing of hands at several specific points during the day, with rules precise enough that dedicated blessings were assigned to accompany them. Given all that, a better and far more interesting question emerges. Ancient people washed their hands all the time, but for reasons that had nothing to do with preventing germs. And this produced a strange situation where a huge amount of real hygiene benefit occurred purely by accident, driven by the wrong reasoning, while the actual biological explanation behind why it worked stayed hidden for nearly all of human history. Let's start with what ancient people genuinely believed about the importance of washing, because that's where the real story begins. The notion of contamination, that unseen particles from an ill person or a filthy surface could pass to someone else and make them sick, isn't something that comes naturally to the human mind. It's a fairly counterintuitive concept, and when you really consider it, it's impressive that anyone figured it out at all without any technology capable of directly observing microorganisms. Before germ theory took hold in the latter half of the 19th century, the leading explanation for infectious disease across most of the world was some form of miasma theory, the belief that foul air, particularly the odors coming from decaying organic matter, sick individuals, or polluted surroundings, was what caused illness. This theory, despite being wrong about the actual cause, was sophisticated enough to correctly predict many patterns. Disease showed up more frequently near swamps, sewage, and crowded, unsanitary places, and less often in clean, well-ventilated ones. So the theory correctly mapped the pattern of disease even while completely misunderstanding the mechanism behind it. Which is an important point about how a scientific theory can be useful for prediction while still being fundamentally incorrect about causation. Under the miasma framework, washing did have a logical justification. Bad smells were linked to bad air was linked to disease, and washing eliminated bad smells. So washing was tied to health, but the connection was thought to run through the air rather than through direct physical contact. This meant that hand washing specifically, as distinct from general bathing or keeping one's surroundings clean, didn't hold the special status in ancient hygiene thinking that it holds in modern public health. People washed because odor was unpleasant, because society expected it, because religious law demanded it, or simply because it felt good. The fact that washing was also interrupting the fecal-oral transmission of several major diseases was, from the vantage point of the people doing it, purely coincidental. Now let's turn to the dimension of ritual purity specifically, since it stands as one of the most significant and most overlooked forces driving hand-washing behavior throughout history. Ritual purity systems, found in some form across nearly every major religious tradition, generated extensive washing behaviors that were explained through spiritual reasoning rather than any concept of hygiene. In Judaism, the concept of ritual impurity, known as tumah, required washing under specific circumstances, such as after contact with certain categories of objects, before eating, after using the toilet, and after handling a corpse. In Islam, the concept of tahara required wudu, a ritual washing that includes cleansing the hands, face, and feet before prayer. Hindu traditions of ritual bathing, especially ahead of religious observances, also generated consistent hygiene habits. Buddhist monastic codes were explicit enough about hand-washing that historians of hygiene point to them as a factor in lower rates of disease transmission within monastic communities. None of these washing rituals were understood by the people practicing them as a way to prevent germs. They were understood instead as spiritual acts, ways of maintaining readiness for religious observance, or clearing away a state of spiritual contamination. Yet the practical outcome, regular washing that happened to remove pathogens along the way, was the same, no matter what belief system was motivating it. This stands as one of the more remarkable episodes in the history of medicine. where a practice that actually worked came thousands of years before anyone understood why it worked, and understanding the mechanism later on didn't make the practice any more effective, it simply changed the reasoning behind doing it. Let's turn to the history of soap itself, since it's both older and more complicated than most people realize. The earliest known soap recipe, inscribed on a Babylonian clay tablet dated to roughly 2800 BC, describes a combination of water, alkali, and cassia oil, which functions as soap, and it was used to wash wool during textile production rather than for personal hygiene. Egyptian papyri from around 1550 BC describe comparable mixtures of fat and ash used for washing. The Romans developed advanced soap-making techniques and used soap widely, though it's worth noting that early Roman bathing practices actually favored mechanical cleaning with strigils, tools used to scrape oil and dirt from the skin, over the use of soap itself. By the medieval period, soap production had grown into an established industry in cities across Europe, with Castile soap from Spain and Aleppo soap from Syria serving as early examples of soap traded commercially between regions. The underlying chemistry that makes soap effective against pathogens is elegantly simple. Soap molecules have one end that's attracted to water and another end that's attracted to fat. When you wash with soap, the fat-attracting ends latch onto the lipid outer layer of pathogens, including most viruses and many bacteria, while the water-attracting ends allow the whole cluster to be rinsed away under running water. Nobody who made or used soap understood this mechanism until the 20th century. But that didn't stop soap from genuinely reducing pathogen transmission the entire time, even without anyone knowing exactly why soap worked so much better than plain water, which it clearly does. Now let's turn to what might be the single most important moment in the history of hand washing as a medical intervention, because the story is genuinely remarkable and also a useful example of how slowly attitudes can shift even when the evidence in favor is overwhelming. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working at the Vienna General Hospital during the 1840s, where he observed something that seemed to defy the medical understanding of his era. The hospital ran 2 maternity wards that had strikingly different death rates from childbed fever, a postpartum infection that killed a frighteningly large share of women giving birth in hospitals at that time. The first ward, staffed by doctors and medical students who came directly from performing autopsies, had a death rate somewhere between 10 and 15%. The second ward, run by midwives, had a death rate of only around 2%. The gap between the 2 wards was so severe that some women, terrified of being admitted to the first ward, chose instead to give birth in the street. Semmelweis theorized that the mortality difference stemmed from cadaverous particles being carried by doctors and students from the autopsy room to the maternity ward on their unwashed hands. He introduced a hand-washing protocol using a chlorinated lime solution, not soap, and the mortality rate in the first ward dropped to roughly 2%, matching the second ward almost exactly. In effect, he had discovered that hand washing could stop the spread of infectious material that was killing patients, without ever knowing what the particles actually were or how they caused infection in the first place. The medical establishment's reaction was largely dismissive and hostile. His findings were rejected. His theory was seen as far-fetched, and he was eventually committed to a mental institution, where he died from the very kind of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent. His hand-washing protocol was dropped once he left. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch developed germ theory in the decades that followed that Semmelweis's findings finally made sense in hindsight. And modern medicine only recognized him as a pioneer roughly 30 years after his death, long after he had gone largely unacknowledged. The Semmelweis story deserves this much attention because it reveals something genuinely important about how hygiene behavior actually changes. The evidence in favor of hand washing was clear, and the mortality numbers left little room for doubt. But without a mechanistic explanation for why hand washing worked, that evidence wasn't enough to shift established medical practice, partly because accepting it would have meant physicians admitting they were killing their own patients through their failure to wash their hands, a conclusion that was uncomfortable enough, both psychologically and professionally, to push doctors toward rejecting the evidence rather than accepting it. The history of hand washing as a medical practice isn't simply a tale of ignorance being replaced by knowledge. It's also a story about the social and psychological forces that determine whether medical evidence gets accepted or dismissed. Let's move on to germ theory itself and how it changed the picture for hand washing. since its establishment during the 1860s and 1870s transformed things in principle, even though actual behavioral change across the general population took much longer to catch up. Louis Pasteur's work in microbiology, along with Joseph Lister's application of antiseptic techniques in surgery, which was directly inspired by Pasteur's research, established that specific microorganisms were responsible for specific diseases, and that these organisms could be eliminated with the right chemical treatments. This gave hand-washing a mechanistic justification that Semmelweis's statistics alone had never been able to provide, and it triggered a major shift in hospital hygiene practices that significantly cut down surgical death rates. Still, the shift from hospital-based reform to widespread public education about hand-washing moved much more slowly and required sustained public health campaigning throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries. During the era when germ theory was taking hold, bacteria were the primary concern, and preventing fecal-oral transmission of diseases like cholera and typhoid through hand-washing became a central goal of the early public health movement. But turning this scientific understanding of microbial transmission into widespread behavior change required more than education. It also required building the physical infrastructure that makes regular hand-washing possible in the first place, meaning access to running water, soap, and clean towels, none of which were available everywhere in the world until fairly recently. Now let's bring up something genuinely important about the hygiene practices that ancient people got right, setting aside hand-washing specifically, because ancient humans were far from defenseless against pathogen transmission. Many traditional food practices that we now understand through the lens of microbiology, such as cooking meat thoroughly, preserving food through fermentation, salting or drying, and avoiding certain foods under certain conditions, had real effects in reducing pathogens, even though the justification at the time was about taste, tradition, or religious law rather than science. Fermentation, in particular, creates an acidic environment that inhibits the growth of most pathogens, which explains why fermented foods are often safer to eat than raw foods carrying similar levels of contamination. Fermentation as a food preservation method developed across nearly every human culture out of practical necessity rather than any understanding of microbiology, but the microbial benefit was nonetheless real. Traditional quarantine practices are another example of effective pathogen control achieved without any knowledge of germ theory. The word quarantine actually comes from the Italian quarantino, referring to the 40-day isolation period that Venice imposed on ships arriving during the Black Death. This practice reduced transmission effectively, despite there being no understanding at all of how plague actually spread, because isolating potentially infected people from the general population reduces transmission regardless of whether anyone understands the underlying mechanism or knows whether to call the cause Yersinia pestis or simply bad air blowing in from the east. The long history of isolating sick individuals, which has been documented across many cultures in various forms, represents a case where multiple societies independently arrived at a genuinely effective disease control method without ever having the theoretical framework that would explain why it worked. There's something else worth noting about the hand-washing behavior that ancient people definitely did practice, and specifically, what diseases it was actually preventing. The effectiveness of ancient hygiene practices, viewed through the lens of epidemiology, was uneven in ways that line up precisely with what germ theory would predict, even though ancient practitioners had no way of anticipating this. Washing hands before meals, a practice found broadly across many cultures for reasons of etiquette and ritual purity, interrupts the fecal-oral route that spreads gastrointestinal illnesses, including cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, and various other major killers. Cultures that consistently practiced ritual hand-washing before eating would have experienced, all else being equal, lower rates of these particular diseases compared to cultures that didn't follow this practice. And this happened through a mechanism that nobody involved actually understood. This epidemiological signature of ritual hygiene as a form of disease prevention is genuinely detectable in historical disease patterns once you know what to look for. Now let's turn to the present moment, in hand-washing specifically, because the evidence supporting its effectiveness has never been stronger, and the infrastructure needed to support hand-washing has never been more widely accessible. And yet, hand hygiene compliance remains a serious public health issue, even in settings where people fully understand why it matters. Studies of healthcare worker hand hygiene compliance in hospitals, which is closely tracked because it's directly measurable and consequential, often find compliance rates below 60%. Even in facilities where hand-washing protocols are spelled out clearly, signage is posted everywhere, and staff have been thoroughly educated about both the underlying science and the stakes involved in terms of patient mortality. This continued lack of compliance, in an environment where the reasoning is fully understood, suggests that knowledge by itself isn't enough to drive consistent behavior, and that the real barriers to hand hygiene aren't mainly about a lack of understanding. There's something genuinely interesting to note about Roman bath culture specifically, since it represents one of the most elaborate hygiene systems developed anywhere in the ancient world, one that has actually gotten a somewhat unfair reputation historically. The common image of Roman baths as shared pools of increasingly dirty water used by hundreds of people isn't completely inaccurate, but it overlooks the considerable sophistication behind the Roman bathing system. The major Roman bath complexes, known as thermae, moved water through a sequence of rooms that grew progressively hotter, with the frigidarium, tepidarium, and caldarium marking distinct temperature stages that served both social purposes and cleaning functions. The hypocaust system, which heated floors from underneath to maintain these temperatures, represented real engineering achievement, and the aqueduct infrastructure the Romans built to supply fresh water to these bath complexes was substantial. In other words, the baths weren't just stagnant, dirty pools, but systems with both incoming fresh water and drainage that were, given the technology available at the time, reasonably advanced. What the Roman baths failed to do was stop the spread of waterborne and contact-transmitted pathogens in the way that a modern understanding of disease transmission would demand. Warm shared water used by many bathers creates an ideal environment for certain skin conditions, fungal infections, and pathogens spread through contaminated water. Romans did suffer from these conditions, and the baths played a role in that, but this connection was completely invisible to them at the time, since the causal link between shared bathwater and fungal skin infections wasn't understood. So the baths functioned as both a genuine public health benefit, through the physical removal of surface contamination, and as a venue for spreading pathogens through the warm shared water, in ways ancient people had no way of telling apart. There's something worth noting about the development of clean water infrastructure and how it relates to hygiene behavior, because access to water has shaped hand-washing habits in ways that often go underappreciated. The Roman investment in aqueducts, which brought fresh water into cities on a scale unmatched anywhere in the Western world until the 19th century, made frequent washing practically achievable in a way it simply wasn't in most other ancient cities. Roman urban residents had access to running water through public fountains and bath complexes at a level that people living in most medieval European cities did not have once that aqueduct infrastructure had collapsed. So the decline in hand-washing behavior seen in medieval Europe is partly a story about the loss of water infrastructure that had made washing convenient, not purely a story about declining knowledge or motivation around hygiene. This relationship between water access and hand hygiene remains directly relevant on a global scale today. Current estimates suggest that more than 2 billion people around the world lack access to a basic hand-washing facility with soap and water, which means the obstacle to hand-washing compliance for these populations isn't a lack of knowledge or motivation, but a lack of physical access to the necessary resources. Public health campaigns focused on hand-washing education in low-resource settings have run into the problem that education alone can't increase hand-washing where the supporting infrastructure simply doesn't exist, which has pushed global health organizations toward investing in infrastructure as a companion to behavioral education rather than relying on education alone. Let's also bring up something genuinely interesting about the specific pathogens that hand-washing is most effective against, since the fecal-oral transmission route that hand-washing most directly interrupts is responsible for a range of diseases that have been major killers throughout history. Cholera, caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae and spread through fecally contaminated water and food, killed millions of people during the pandemic waves of the 19th century that swept across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi and sharing a similar transmission route, was a leading cause of urban death before modern water treatment existed. Hepatitis A, norovirus, rotavirus, and many other intestinal pathogens share transmission routes that are interrupted specifically by washing hands after using the toilet and before preparing or eating food. The global burden of diarrheal disease, which remains a leading cause of child mortality in low-income countries despite being almost entirely preventable, is directly tied to hand hygiene and water sanitation. Understanding which pathogens respond most to hand hygiene also helps resolve a historical puzzle. Why didn't cultures with especially strict ritual hygiene standards necessarily show dramatically lower overall mortality from infectious disease? The answer is that many of history's biggest killers, including plague, smallpox, influenza, malaria, and typhus, spread primarily through routes other than the fecal-oral pathway that hand-washing is most effective against. Plague spreads mainly through fleas, smallpox through respiratory droplets in contact with lesions, malaria through mosquito bites, and typhus through lice. Hand-washing wouldn't have meaningfully lowered death rates from any of these diseases, even if practiced flawlessly. This selective effectiveness of hand hygiene means that while the benefit of historical ritual washing practices was genuine, it was limited to the specific set of diseases where fecal-oral or direct contact transmission is the primary route. Finally, let's bring up what modern hand-washing research reveals about the gap between knowing that something works and actually doing it consistently, since this is genuinely relevant to understanding both ancient and modern behavior around hygiene. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered one of the most intense public hand-washing campaigns in history, supported by saturation media coverage, clearly communicated scientific reasoning, and strong social pressure to comply. Self-reported rates of hand-washing rose sharply in surveys taken during the early stages of the pandemic. Whether people's actual hand-washing behavior changed as much as their reported behavior suggests is harder to determine. Still, the episode showed both how strongly knowledge and motivation can shape hygiene behavior, and how quickly that behavioral shift can fade once the sense of urgency from the crisis starts to wear off. Ancient people who didn't wash their hands specifically to prevent disease weren't simply missing a piece of information that, once given to them, would have permanently altered their habits. They were human beings whose hygiene behavior, much like that of people today, was shaped as much by immediate social pressures and personal motivation as by any abstract knowledge of long-term consequences. So why didn't ancient people wash their hands specifically to prevent disease? Because they had no way of knowing the actual mechanism by which hand hygiene stops disease from spreading. Because the dominant explanatory framework of the time, Miasma Theory, didn't specifically point to hand-to-mouth contact as a route of transmission. And because, without that framework in place, hand-washing as a distinct practice, separate from general bathing or keeping one's surroundings clean, never earned a privileged place in how people thought about preventing disease. What they did instead was wash their hands constantly, driven by social convention, religious duty, ritual purity, and simple personal comfort. And this produced enormous incidental hygiene benefits that kept pathogen transmission considerably lower than it otherwise would have been, all without anyone involved ever understanding why it was happening. The modern hand-washing movement didn't invent hygiene from scratch. What it actually did was supply the missing explanation for practices that had already been preventing disease transmission for thousands of years, long before anyone realized that was what they were doing all along.